Welcome back to the podcast here. It's been a couple weeks. We got to blow the dust off the mic, but we have a lot to talk about in college football. We've seen 3 top 10 matchups over the past 3 weeks, 2 potentially game of the years in back-to-back weeks with the Red River Shootout, Texas-Oklahoma, and then the Washington-Oregon game 2 weeks ago. And we saw Ohio State beat Penn State pretty handily last week. But before we recap the season, today's episode is going to be kind of a special on the 2 teams that I kind of care about following the most, one being Clemson football and the other being the rival South Carolina football. So we got a Palmetto State special episode today. Before we begin, special shout out to the unofficial sponsors of the video, United Reynolds Sumter Branch, David Quincy at the counter. Appreciate the support. So to begin, let's talk about South Carolina football and where they're at today. A lot of people, some people even calling for Shane Beamer's head and saying that he needs to be fired and already looking at potential replacements. And I think that's absolutely insane to say as a fan, as an analyst, whatever. Last year you were hyping up Beamer to be a rising star in the coaching world. To finish off the regular season, you beat Tennessee at home, who, if they don't lose that game, they're going to the playoffs. And then you beat Clemson in Death Valley, who, if they don't lose that game, they're going to the playoffs. So you beat 2 playoff contenders in back-to-back weeks, and you really dominated the Tennessee game. You almost beat Notre Dame in what was one of the better bowls of the bowl season. Shane Beamer's first year at Carolina, the over-under win total was 4.5. He wins 7 games, including the bowl. His second year, the over-under was 6.5. He wins 7 games, not including the bowl, with 2 top 10 wins. This year, the over-under was 6.5, and Carolina's probably not going to make a bowl. The season's kind of going off the rails. But I personally think the Carolina football team this year is better than it was any of the previous 2 years. Spencer Rattler's playing as one of the best SEC QBs, probably top 3 in the SEC, maybe top 4. You've got Xavier Legette playing at a really high level. You just have a lot of issues elsewhere. And I think if you put this team last year, you probably beat Notre Dame in the bowl game. You may sneak out another regular season win. And if you put this team where Carolina was 2 years ago, you're looking at another 7 or 8 win team. You have a slightly harder schedule this year in terms of game placement and season dynamics. You went toe-to-toe with Georgia in Athens, which is always hard to do. You couldn't pull out the victory, but you led them at halftime. And while you don't look for pity wins, or you don't want to hype up a loss as a good loss, it was a good loss, even though Georgia is not where they have been the past 2 years. So you've had marquee wins under Beamer, and you've got revamped recruiting. You just landed a top 25 class. You're going to land another top 25 class this year. You weren't doing that the years before Beamer. You weren't even coming close to it. You weren't landing any talent at all. You just landed 5-star Nicholas Simmons. You got another 5-star on the defensive line. You've got Lenore Sellers waiting in the wings at the QB spot. Carolina football is in good hands under Shane Beamer. It is okay to say that the season is gone. You're not going to make a bowl game because the rest of the season you're not going to win enough. You got to win 4 more games at this point, and I don't see 4 wins on a schedule that includes Kentucky, A&M this week, Clemson. You just have a gauntlet of a schedule, and it's not going to be easy to get done, and it's not going to get done. With that being said, you can still look at this season as progress forward, because I do think Carolina is getting better based off this year. And it's okay to say that change needs to happen, especially on the defensive staff and on the defensive roster. You have to hit portal additions this year. Shane Beamer's not afraid to use the portal, and that's a good thing. And that's going to be good for Carolina. I also think that it's important for lack of better words, and it's going to be hard to hear this as a Carolina fan, but you got to know your place in college football. And the same could be said about Clemson 10 years ago, 15 years ago when Dabo took over. You're not at the top of the college football pecking order. You're in the SEC, so that puts you in the upper half, but you're at the bottom of the SEC. You're in Columbia, South Carolina. You have access to talent, and South Carolina recruits the state of South Carolina really well. They out-recruit Clemson and the state of South Carolina. But you have to deal with Georgia. You have to deal with Alabama. You have to deal with Florida. You have to deal with Tennessee. You're about to have to deal with Texas and Oklahoma. your backs are against the wall in your own conference, and because of that, your backs are against the wall in the nation in terms of making the playoffs. That's not to say Carolina cannot become a contender. Steve Spurrier did it for a couple years. I think Shane Beamer has the ability to get Carolina into playoff contention. Maybe not on a every year basis, but every other year. It's not going to be easy for any team in the country to compete at a year-by-year basis, but especially a team that is held back by the financial capabilities such as South Carolina. You don't have the same amount of money as Georgia. You don't have the same amount of money to spend as Oregon or Washington. You don't have the same amount of money to spend as Ohio State or Texas. And those are real constraints as college football moves forward. That doesn't mean you can't compete, and it doesn't mean you shouldn't expect to compete, but it does mean that you have to be aware of expectation level as a fan. You can't expect to win the national championship every year as a Carolina fan, nor really can you as a Clemson fan, especially nowadays. Only one team wins the national championship every year. So you should expect better from Carolina football, 100%, especially based off the last 2 years. But you got to give Beamer time. You can't look at coaches like Deion Sanders, who's just flipped around Colorado and turned them around in 1 year. Nobody else is Deion Sanders. Nobody's ever going to be able to do what Deion Sanders does or has done this year with Colorado, because he's Deion Sanders, and there's only one person that can market Deion Sanders the way Deion Sanders can, and that's himself. It's going to take time, and it's going to take some bumps in the road to get Carolina football back at the level they were under Spurrier in his prime. Shane Beamer, I think, is the guy to do that. I think it would be a huge mistake moving forward if Carolina football was to let go of Shane Beamer. With that being said, changes do need to be made. As Carolina fans, y'all should have the expectation that changes do need to be made and that they will be made. Moving on to a team in the upstate, Clemson football. Clemson football this year came in as a preseason top 10, tied at the top with Florida State to win the ACC in terms of preseason odds. Was a favorite by some to make the playoffs. If they won the ACC, they were going to make the playoffs. And they dropped a Week 1 game to Duke, 28-7. They dropped a Week 4 game to Florida State after missing a field goal in overtime. And then they just dropped another overtime game to Miami. Clemson has been on the 1-yard line 4 times this year, coming away with 0 points. They lead the nation in fumbles with 10, the only double-digit team, or the only team with double-digit fumbles on the year. And they are in 126th in the country in red zone offense. So, where is Clemson right now? If you look back at 2013 to really 2 years ago with Florida State, I think that's where Clemson football is at. I think Clemson is seeing a similar downward trajectory that Florida State saw in the last years of Jimbo Fisher, and what kind of started their years of dormancy in the ACC and in the national landscape over the past 5-6 years, excluding this year. You had DeAndre Francois at QB. I think Cade Klubnik is almost a picture-perfect comparison of DeAndre Francois. You had a awful recruiting line, which really was a problem of offensive line recruiting. Florida State failed to recruit the offensive line. Minus last year, Clemson has done nothing to build up the offensive line. You really lack downfield receiver talent. Same thing can be applied here to Clemson. And quite frankly, you had a non-elite staff. I don't think Clemson has an elite coaching staff at all. I think they, if they're not average, they're below average. I don't think they're an above average staff. I think, there's a lot of nepotism in the coaching staff. I think a lot of former players have been given opportunities as off-the-field coaches, and then some even on-the-field coaches. And I think that's a great thing Dabo does, giving former players an opportunity to begin to make a name for themselves. But not everybody deserves the same shot, and it's okay to also go get elite guys. If you look at some of Nick Saban's best staffs, if you go back, I believe it was somewhere from 2010 to 2015, one of those years, he had 10 coaches who ended up becoming head coaches on his staff, from coordinator positions to position coaches to off-the-field analysts. Right now, besides Garrett Riley, and maybe like Nick Eason, maybe Mike Reed, I don't really see anybody on Clemson's staff who's going to become a head coach at all. There's not really an elite coach outside of Nick Eason and Garrett Riley. on the staff. Mike Reed's a really good coach. He interviewed at Georgia last year. He could potentially leave, especially with the way Clemson's program is trending. I also think Lamonsky Hall is a good defensive ends coach. But outside of that, you have no star power. You have no names besides really Garrett Riley at OC. And that's a problem when you're at Clemson and you're what Clemson has been the past 15 years, 10 win seasons, 2 national championship wins, 4 appearances. You went to the playoffs 7 straight years. You should have, anybody that you want, you should basically be able to go get outside of a couple of names at position coaches, at coordinator, whatever. And Dabo has not done that. And because of that, we've seen suffering on the recruiting trail of some positions, mainly the wide receiver position group and the offensive line. This current class, you have Bryant Wesco and TJ Moore, who are really good receivers, but, it might end up being too little too late for Clemson. And I think a large part of this is the nepotism and the lack of recruiting aggression and the lack of transfer portal. Is Dabo Swinney, the head coach, is ultra set in his ways. He believes what worked 7 years ago is going to be what works now. College football is not a lake or a pond. It is not a stagnant body of water. It is a river with a very strong current that is constantly changing. Florida's 2 of the losses this year are teams that have completely rebuilt their roster through the transfer portal, Florida State and Miami. And while I don't necessarily like the portal, if it's available to use and you're getting paid $11 million a year to coach a football team to win national championships, you should do it. You should do what it takes to win. If you're not going to recruit at a top 3 class every year level, then you need to go use the portal to supplement the talent. It's not going to work. The strategy Dabo Swinney's trying to use is not going to work the way it did in 2015, 2016, 2018. And quite frankly, it's unacceptable that he's been so set in his ways of changing. Some other things to talk about with the coaching staff. One big thing on the defensive side of the ball, Clemson's defensively has been better this year than they were last year. I had a big question mark at our defensive coordinator position with Wes Goodwin, and I still do. And I think that's because losing Brent Venables was one of the biggest losses in coaching from an assistant coach position over the past 5 to 6 years. Brent Venables wasn't just a great defensive mind. He wasn't just a great developer. He brought an intensity, which I think is extra important for the defensive side of the ball. When your job is to go stop an offense from scoring, you got to have some kind of intensity at the top there. And I don't think Wes Goodwin brings that to the table. I think he's a really smart mind on the defensive side of the ball, and I think he did really good work for Clemson when he was behind the scenes. Unfortunately, I think he was better behind the scenes than he is on the scenes or in front of everybody. He doesn't bring intensity, and you can see that in the way Clemson has played the last 2 years on defense. We've been sloppy tackling the ball. We've been sloppy with some discipline. We've been sloppy down the field in coverage. There's been a lack of adjustment in game. And that's been an issue for 2 years straight now. You saw it against Wake Forest last year. You saw it against Notre Dame. You saw it against South Carolina. You saw it against Tennessee. You saw it against Duke this year. We got beat 4 or 5 times with halfback or tight end swing routes to the sidelines. Florida State, you were getting pressure on Jordan Travis, and then in the most critical moments of the game, you just decide to send a 4-man rush and somehow still leave a true freshman corner on one-on-one with Keon Coleman. That's unacceptable as a second-year defensive coordinator at Clemson University. You saw it against Miami. There was just a complete lack of pass rush, a complete lack of run defense. And 2 years prior with Brent Venables as defensive coordinator, that was unheard of. Clemson was going to live in your backfield on the defensive side of the ball. And this year, Clemson hasn't. They're towards the bottom in sacks. They do have a higher pass rush win rate, so the sack number needs to kind of be adjusted for expectation. Clemson is doing a good job of getting pressure, but when you play teams like Wake Forest, your 5 stars should be able to get pressure against their 2 and 3 stars. Mike Reed might be on his way out. And as we mentioned before, there's been a critical lack of elite recruiting at certain position groups and also a critical lack of player development at certain position groups. This one primarily focusing on the offensive side of the ball at wide receiver and offensive line. At wide receiver, you've seen a lack of separation, and you've seen that dating back to Trevor Lawrence's days as QB. You just had a guy who was a generational QB prospect who was able to make up for it. You know, T. Higgins and Amari Rodgers, once they were gone, there wasn't anybody who ever really stepped up after that. Justin Ross was hurt his entire career, but even Justin Ross, after his breakout freshman year, he regressed year by year, minus the injuries. You've seen a lack of speed at the receiver position, and that's not necessarily a talent development issue. That's just a lack of aggression on the recruiting trail. There's no reason you can't go get a guy who can run a 4.4 40 at wide receiver if you're Clemson football the way Clemson football has been. You've also seen a lack of elite ball skills on your ball-dominant receivers. Guys like Mike Williams, T. Higgins, Sammy Watkins, DeAndre Hopkins, even guys like Deion Kane. Those guys made their money going up on a 1v1 and coming down with a 50-50 ball. They weren't 50-50 balls when you tossed it up to those guys. They were a 60-40 or a 70-30 ball. Deshaun Watson and Trevor Lawrence and Kelly Bryant were able to get away with some risky throws because they could trust their guys to go up and get it because they were the more physically dominant, more athletic, and better players on the field. And kind of building off of that, compare Clemson's wide receiver room of the past 2 to 3 years to the Clemson wide receiver room during the championship runs, and even before that with Taj Boyd. The offensive line position group. From fall camp, coaches were raving about this offensive line. This was supposed to be the best offensive line Clemson has had, period, under Dabo Swinney, which really isn't saying much because Clemson's never had an offensive line that won games and never had an offensive line that was going to dominate on the field. But this was supposed to be the best one that we've had. It was supposed to be able to push the line. At the run game, it was supposed to be able to protect the passer. We have 3 starters who started last year and are starting this year who have lower season blocking grades in both run and pass blocking this year than they did the year before. That is talent regression, and it's a lack of player development. There's no reason 3 of your 5 offensive line starters should have lower grades on season totals so far this year. And quite frankly, that's inexcusable, especially considering the reports that you were getting out of fall camp. Moving on from that, I think there's also potentially a culture issue established from that lack of intensity in the coaching staff. Ball security has been an issue for Clemson dating back to last year. I think the Miami game last year, Clemson had 4 fumbles, and they just happened to recover every single one. This game, that didn't happen. There were multiple fumbles, and then there were turnovers or interceptions. Clemson leads the nation in fumbles on the year, just passing Troy this past game as we fumbled the ball twice. Again, one time on the 1-yard line. Will Shipley has been concerning with the ball. Phil Maffa, who has had his ball security issues as well, has just flat out not gotten touches at all, even though he's been better with the ball than Will Shipley has. You've also seen a lack of player leadership at critical positions. There's not in my opinion, from what I've seen on the field and seen in reports and read from guys who have inside access to Clemson, there's not a KJ Henry this year who can step up on the D-line. There's not a Ben Boulware or James Skalski. There's not a Mackenzie Alexander in the secondary. I think the secondary at Clemson's ultra-talented. I think there's a lot of guys who play to win, but I don't think there's that true leader that's emerged on defense or on offense. I don't think Shipley has been the leader that he was the past 2 years, and I think I don't know what it stems from. I don't know if it is a culture issue or it's just an intensity issue in the coaching staff or what it is, but there's just a lack of aggression on the field and a lack of physicality on the field from these past 2 to 3 years of Clemson football. So some more specific notes from the Miami game, which I think outside of the Florida State game where you saw special teams trouble, you saw a scoop and score off of a sack that Cade Klubnik did not see coming, and then you saw just the boneheaded RPO play from Cade Klubnik on 4th and 1. In overtime, I think the Miami game is the perfect epitome of Clemson football this year. Some key stats: the rushing game. Miami ran the ball 38 times for 211 yards, averaged 6 yards a carry. Clemson ran the ball 31 times for 34 yards, averaged just over 1 yard a carry. Miami lived in the Clemson backfield. They had 5 sacks and 10 total tackles for loss, which led to negative 56 yards of offense lost on those 10 plays. Miami tackled Clemson in the backfield for more yards than Clemson had rushing. The passing game was carried by Jake Brenningstool. He set a single-game receiving yards for tight ends record at Clemson. However, in the critical moments, schematically and Cade throwing the ball, we could not get the ball to the best player on the field at that time, which is an issue. You lacked a critical game changer. In past games, that's been Will Shipley. This game, it was shaping up to be Jake Brenningstool. Other games, it's been T. Higgins. But in this game, we couldn't find somebody to finish the way we've had other guys finish games in the past. You go look at like Georgia with Brock Bowers. Georgia is undefeated right now because of Brock Bowers. And now he's hurt, which we'll talk about in the next episode. But there's nobody that's emerged for Clemson in that department over the past 3 years, which I think is a major issue. It's the fifth time we've been inside the 10-yard line this season. The fourth time we've been on the 1-yard line and came away with 0 points. Absolutely unexcusable. Absolutely unexcusable. Clemson has a tendency to just get in the shotgun every single time instead of just getting under center and pushing the pile. Clemson's been physically dominated on the line, which has been unheard of in the past. It's the second time the game has come down to a 1-yard conversion. Florida State game being the other time, and Clemson could not get it. I already said they lead the nation in fumbles. They're 126 in red zone offense. And you've just seen some boneheaded QB play from Cade time and time again this year. I already mentioned some Duke plays. I already mentioned some Florida State plays. And I want to talk about, not just I'm not even going to talk about the overtime play on 4th and goal at the 1, where he just completely disregarded the play call and took the ball himself. I'm going to talk about on the last drive of the game before the game went to OT. Clemson went 3 and out in 15 seconds. The first 2 were incomplete passes. Why Clemson decided to throw the ball on 3rd down again and give Miami 50 seconds to drive down the field, I have no clue. But on that 3rd down, we're at our own 25-yard line, and Cade just throws it up. The receiver is boxed out with no space on the sideline. The rush is there, and he just throws up a pass. The game could have ended right there because there were 3 Miami defenders in the area, and they just couldn't come away with the ball. But you've just seen absolutely boneheaded QB play, high school level play from Clemson's starting quarterback this year, and that has to change. He's had 2 years with the program. He's had 8 to 9 months with Garrett Riley now, and I think he has all the arm talent in the world. I think he could be a really special QB. He makes incredible plays, and he also makes really terrible plays. And you're never going to be a championship team when you have that kind of 50-50 play at the QB spot. Another point of note, I know I talked about a lack of intensity on defense. However, the defense is playing at a championship level right now. And just time and time again this year, they've just been left for dead on the field. Miami game, Miami didn't score till the 4th quarter. In the second half, Clemson maintained a lead until that, and they gave the offense, plenty of opportunities to put the game away, and Clemson just couldn't. Lack of conversions on 3rd down, incomplete passes to open receivers. Cade just missed the ball. Lack of blocking to get the run game going. The offense just stagnated, and had all Clemson needed was 1 field goal. You look at in the second half, the fumble that Cade had, that fumble was at the 30-yard line of Miami. He doesn't fumble the ball there, and Clemson kicks a field goal and doesn't even have to worry about going into overtime because the game's over. And that's if Clemson would make the field goal. Special teams has been notoriously bad this year. So based off of this, where does Clemson go from here? Priority number 1 is getting rid of the pride in the building wherever it's at. If it's at the head coach spot, if it's at another spot, getting rid of that and self-auditing the entire program and seeing what needs to be changed. You got to keep the current recruiting class together because it's a really good one and it has the chance to be really special. And you got to keep the team together too. I don't know if any players are down about this season looking to transfer. I could certainly understand it, but you got to keep the talent here. You've got to use the portal this offseason. There's no excuse not to use it this offseason. You don't have enough incoming talent from recruiting to not use it. You need a dynamic receiver who can win a one-on-one ball and who can create space down the field. You need talent on the offensive line. That's not going to be true freshmen. And you need depth on defense because you lost a lot last year and you're going to lose a lot this year to the draft. Peter Woods and TJ Parker can't be the only ones returning on the defensive line, and you can't expect them to dominate games when it's the only two guys next year. Vic Burley will be back. Tamarion Parker will step up. But you got to have more depth at the D-line. You're going to have more depth at linebacker. I imagine Barrett Carter and Jeremiah Trotter Jr. will both be leaving. And I could see Makuba, Mickens, Nate Wiggins all declaring Sheridan Jones is gone after this year. So you got a lot of pieces you're losing on the defensive side of the ball. If you don't want to change the portal philosophy, which you have to change for this current offseason, you got to change your recruiting strategy. There's no more time to be complacent with landing 18 guys and having the number 10 to 14 recruiting class in the country. You've got to have a top 3 to top 4 recruiting class every year. You've got to be going out and getting 25 guys. You got to be going out after the top dogs every single year, top 100 players, top 200 players across all positions, and you've got to build high-volume, high-quality classes. You got to do what Georgia has. Up until this past year, Georgia has been almost non-existent in the transfer portal. They haven't needed to. You've got to become that way if you don't want to use the transfer portal. I also think there's a culture adjustment that needs to be made, whether that's hiring a coach with more intensity or changing up some regimens in the practice regiments, film room, something along those lines, and maybe even strength and conditioning. Clemson's not the disciplined, gritty, physically dominant team that played with attitude and, quite frankly, played with like some swagger on the field. You date back to Ben Boulware, Mackenzie Alexander. I think back to 2016, those guys played like they knew they were going to win, and they played hard and they played aggressive and they hit QB, they hit the running backs. They played disciplined. They didn't commit many penalties, and they played the way Clemson football should be played based off of what fans have become expected of. With that being said, I think there are some certain staff changes that could be made and potentially should be made based off the way this season ends up going. I think one thing you want to do is you want to keep Mike Reed and you want to keep Nick Eason, and you probably want to keep Lamoski Hall as well. I think you can find some kind of role for them to elevate them a little bit higher, give them some more responsibility, whether that's becoming the director of transfer portal recruiting or something along those lines. I think on Mike Reed's note, you need to make him just a DB's coach and something else, not a special teams coordinator. We need a guy to come in and just be the special teams coordinator, fix the kicking issue, fix the punting issue, and build some creativity in our special teams game. Punt fakes, onside kick recoveries. There needs to be some unique element of play that Clemson special teams has that they haven't. Blocking punts. Clemson's notoriously bad at that. And I identified Jacob Brunowski, who is the current Miami of Ohio special teams coordinator, as a potential replacement or potential hire for that spot. He's 29 years old, but he is considered to be a rising star in the coaching industry. In his first year at Miami of Ohio, their special teams improved from 101st in the nation to 50th in the nation. And this year they're playing at a higher level than that as well. I think he would be a massive improvement and could give Clemson an edge in the third phase of the game, special teams. On the offensive line, I think Jim Harding, the offensive line coach at Utah, would be an elite hire, and there's no reason Clemson can't go get him from Utah. You can offer more money. He has more opportunity. He's going to have more exposure, and he'll probably have a higher chance to win national championships. He is responsible for bringing in 2 of the highest-rated recruits in Utah's highest-rated recruiting class in their school history. He has numerous all-conference selections on the offensive line. And if you watch Utah football, you see an offensive line that attacks the defensive line right off the snap. They attack at the point, or they play at the point of attack, and they play with a physicality that, quite frankly, Clemson's never really played with, but they should be playing with. I also think that you could look at some new receiver coaches as well. Kevin Cummings, wide receiver coach at Arizona. He was the main recruiter for the highest-rated recruit in Arizona history, which is a receiver who's committed in this current class. He has coached the wide receiver unit to 2 1,000-yard receivers and 3 700-plus-yard receivers in the same season for the first time in Arizona history, happening last year. And he's got Arizona's offense he's helped Arizona's offense get off to a really good start this year. You just saw them blow out Washington State last week, or 2 weeks ago, and they play Oregon State this week. He's a hot name that's going to be rising in the coaching ranks. Another potential option at receiver coach is Jacob Peeler at Missouri. He is an elite recruiter and developer. He recruited Luther Burden, Dominique Levet, and he's also developed Luther Burden, who's going to be a first-round pick this year if he declares for the draft. Dominique Levet just transferred to Georgia. They were 2 1,000-yard receivers last year, one of the only teams to have 2 1,000-yard receivers in the same unit. Missouri's passing game is playing at an elite level this year. He just went toe-to-toe with Texas Longhorns for the recruitment of Ryan Wingo, so much that he had a crystal ball. Texas, one of the biggest brands in the country, ended up just beating him on signing day, or on his announcement. That would be a massive boost to receiver recruiting at Clemson, and it'd be probably a massive boost to receiver development for some guys that I think have a really solid chance of being good playmakers. Antonio Williams, Tyler Brown, Troy Stellado's come on really strong this year. Adam Randall, I think, still has all the talent in the world. You've got Bryant Westcott coming in and TJ Moore, and I think there's room to recruit at an even higher level and develop talent at an even higher level. Overall, I think there's a lot of changes that need to happen for Clemson to stay competitive, and if changes aren't made, I do believe Clemson football is on the downfall, especially at the national level. I really don't see them competing in the ACC at this current rate either. I think Florida State's going to be here to stay. I think Miami's going to be here to stay. North Carolina has the chance to be here to stay. I think Georgia Tech is a program that's going to rise. I think Virginia Tech has the ability to arise. Louisville is playing at a really high level. If Duke can keep Mike Elko, they're playing at a really high level. The ACC is going to be really competitive at the current rate that it's going. And it's already the most slept-on conference in the country, in my opinion. They've done really well in out-of-conference play, and they have a lot of really under-the-radar teams and players that people across the country just really have not paid attention to. And if Clemson doesn't do something fast, if Dabo Swinney doesn't do something fast, I don't think Clemson's going to be at the top of the national ranks, and I don't really think they're going to be at the top of the ACC ranks anymore. With that being said, that's this episode. Another episode will be dropping later this week, recapping everything that's happened from the last episode to now in the season. Probably some new playoff picks and previewing this week's upcoming games. And we're going to get back to weekly uploads covering the previous week's games and the upcoming week's games as well. Thank you all for watching.